making the time available this evening to come to the 11th Annual Wheelwright Memorial Lecture. My name's Elizabeth Hill. I'm the Chair of the Department of Political Economy here at the University of Sydney, and on behalf of my colleagues in the department, we want to extend a very warm welcome to you all to this event. As part of our welcome, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built, and as we share our own knowledge, our teaching, our learning, and our research practices within this university, we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of the country. I would like to especially extend a very warm welcome to Ted Wheelwright's daughter, Sarah Muston. Sarah is always here at the event, and we are very pleased to be hosting her again. Welcome to colleagues from around the university. I know there's people from within my own school, the School of Social and Political Sciences, as well as the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and beyond, so welcome to you. Welcome to friends of the Political Economy Department and also to interested members of the public. We're always really thrilled to provide this kind of gathering at which so many of you turn up to express your support and also to engage in some of the more contemporary thought in political economy. So thank you. Our evening begins with an official welcome from the head of the School of Social and Political Sciences, Professor Lisa Adkins. She will provide a welcome and then we will turn immediately to the lecture proper. This will be followed by a short question and answer session, which I will chair. So get your questions ready with the emphasis on questions, not commentary. So keep that in mind. Maybe you might like to think about the question, that fits within maybe 20 words and ends with a question mark. That would be much appreciated by myself and also our speaker. And the lecture will conclude promptly at 7:30 for those of you who have other things they need to do. So, without any further ado, I want to invite the head of the School of Political and Social Sciences, Professor Lisa Adkins, to welcome you and introduce the 11th Annual Wheelwright Lecturer Speaker, Professor Alfredo Saad-Filho. Welcome, Lisa.
And also the broader Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences to this 11th Annual Wheelwright Lecture and to introduce our esteemed speaker. So this annual lecture, the EL or Ted Wheelwright Memorial Lecture, there's a picture here of Ted, is held to commemorate the pioneering role that he played in developing the field of political economy in Australia more very broadly, but also specifically at the University of Sydney. The Department of Political Economy at Sydney is absolutely thriving, and I see it as a pivotal part of our school. And it continues to set agendas both nationally and internationally. As one might expect in this context, the Wheelwright Lecture has previously been delivered by pivotal figures in the field. This has included Warden Bellow, Sheila Dow, Diane Elson, Susan George, Leo Panetich, Eric Olwyn Wright, and last year, of course, Kathy Gibson. And I'm delighted to say that the lecture tonight continues with this tradition with a highly esteemed speaker, Professor Alfredo Saad-Filho, who is Professor of Political Economy at SOAS, University of London. I feel like he hardly needs any introduction, but I'll just say a few words about him. He's got degrees in economics from the Universities of Brasilia and from SOAS. He has worked in universities and research institutions all around the world, including Brazil, Japan, Mozambique, the list seems endless, Switzerland and the UK. His research interests include the political economy of development, industrial policy, neoliberalism, alternative economic policies, Latin American political and economic development, inflation and stabilization, and of course the Labour theory of value. And he's one of the world's leading experts of Marxist economic theory. And he's also author, as everyone here probably knows, of the enormously successful Marxist Capital, which is now in its 6th edition. As well as this book, he's authored and co-authored a number of titles in the field of political economy, including The Value of Marx, Political Economy for Contemporary Capitalism. And his most recent co-authored book is Brazil, Neoliberalism versus Democracy. And he doesn't just produce scholarly works, he's a regular contributor to popular media outlets, including key contributions to debates over recent upheavals in Brazil. And of course, he's a founding member of the International Initiative for the Promotion of Political Economy. So we're exceedingly lucky to have him here tonight, and it gives me great pleasure to invite Alfredo to deliver the Wheelwright lecture, the title of which is Neoliberalism and the Rising Tide of Authoritarianism. Thank you.
Yes, good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. And thanks to Elizabeth Hill for the super organization of this session and for the most amazing Australian welcome. Thank you to the colleagues from the Department of Political Economy for the invitation to come to Sydney for this session. And I'm very grateful to Frank Stilwell for not only finding time to show me around the campus, but also for showing me the one and only red tie that belonged to Ted Wheelwright, and that I think has become a symbol of this meeting. I'm very, very deeply honoured to be here. Australian political economy centred in this department and following on the footsteps of Ted Wheelwright is one of the most vibrant and most innovative today. It thrives both at the level of theory and at the level of engagement with society, which I think is precisely what Ted Wheelwright would like to see. So I'm very, very happy to be here speaking in a lecture named after him. Thank you very much. We live in interesting and disturbing political times, with the election of Donald Trump in the vanguard, straddling the boundary between the unimaginable and the farcical. Trump's combination of media savvy and nationalist populism shows the extent to which disorganized frustration can drive electoral success. And unfortunately, Trump is not an isolated example of the politics of the extreme. We know that in recent times, authoritarian governments have been installed in a wide variety of countries. And the problem that we have then is about the nature of contemporary politics. One aspect of this is the extent to which these phenomena have common roots in economic factors or maybe other factors. Another aspect of this problem is, does this represent something historically unique? Is this capitalism as normal, just stretched and strained by economic crises and by austerity, or is this a new political order that we see emerging? And this is my topic today. So let me start from the conclusion. And my conclusions are four. First is that 2007 saw a severe crisis within neoliberalism that exposed the limits of reliance on finance as the driver of global accumulation. And initially, the crisis was taken by many as a fatal final crisis of neoliberalism, but it proved to be nothing of the sort. The reproduction of the system of accumulation was actually never threatened by alternatives. And in most respects, a decade later, neoliberalism turns out to be stronger than it was 10 years ago. Second conclusion is that the policies and practices associated with neoliberalism and financialization have been drawn into question in the wake of the global crisis, and particularly in the domain of ideology, the myth that the growth of finance could sustain economic prosperity forever, that myth was shattered. That is gone. So after the crisis, what we saw was extensive state intervention launched on an absolutely unprecedented scale to rescue finance, the supposed driver of prosperity. And the states did that through the provision of unlimited resources to large financial institutions, and the biggest banks in the world were both taken into public ownership and targeted for bailouts through easy access to funds at minimum interest rates, through emergency asset purchases, and then through quantitative easing. A decade on, what we find is that those responses did not deliver a renewal of economic performance, even on the limited scale that we experienced in the 1990s, much less in the scale of the post-war economic boom. And recently it has been said and widely accepted that the global economy has entered secular stagnation with no end in sight. So what is it that is going on? My third conclusion is that the economic trials of neoliberalism have been compounded by an escalating crisis of democracy and by a drift towards authoritarianism in a growing number of countries, where we find commonly spectacular leaders driving right-wing exclusionary programs backed up by new mass movements of the far right. And what I will argue today is that this process cannot be reduced to an easily reversible advance of untenable projects that will inevitably fail, projects led by self-centered or thieving or megalomaniac politicians. We will not have a return to politics as normal. And I will then argue, finally, that authoritarian neoliberalism is an original phenomenon. It is typically neoliberal, and it expresses the disorganized fury of masses of people who have lost out under neoliberalism and are confronting a state that has lost legitimacy itself. But this is an unstable arrangement that will tend to evolve towards new forms of fascism. Okay, on this optimistic note, what I will try to do now is to explore these arguments in a little bit more detail. And we live today in the age of neoliberalism. This is political reality. This is also the common sense of our time. This is a stage of capitalism that emerged after the end of the post-war boom, first in the UK and in the USA, and then spread out primarily through Atlanticism and the Washington Consensus. The most important feature of neoliberalism is the financialization of production, the financialization of exchange, the financialization of social reproduction, meaning by this the subsumption of economic and social reproduction by the intensive and extensive accumulation of interest-bearing capital. So financialization will underpin the neoliberal system of accumulation, which itself is articulated through the power of the state. Neoliberalism is not about the withdrawal of the state. It is supported by the power of the state to impose, to drive, to underwrite, to manage the internationalization of production and finance within each territory under the veil of the promotion of non-interventionism. Neoliberalism is the opposite of what it pretends to be. Those processes and financialization as a whole, they have allowed financial institutions to capture a growing share of the value produced. That is, the most typical example, the case of the USA, the profits captured by financial institutions jumped from a little over 10% of total profits in the immediate post-war period to a peak of 41% of total profits in 2002. That share crashed after the crisis, but by 2009 it had already returned to something between 20 and 30% of total profits. Now, finance being an unproductive sector, these are transfers from the non-financial sector, and they have led to the polarization of incomes under neoliberalism. So under neoliberalism, financialization has led both to the recovery of profitability after the crisis of Keynesianism, but also led to rising inequality in almost every region in the world. Now, this is an interpretation of neoliberalism as a stage of capitalism based on financialization, and it leads to a specific understanding of the transformations in the processes of growth, investment, production, employment, finance, and consumption in the world in which we live. Within this particular system of accumulation, some countries have been able to sustain absolutely impressive rates of economic growth, particularly in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, with China becoming recently the export assembly hub for the world. But very, very far from leading to global convergence. What neoliberalism has done is to create new patterns of uneven and combined development, where immense prosperity within and across countries and regions have benefited particular strata of the population that are now commonly referred to as the elites, the oligarchs, the top 1%, the top 0.01%. That staggering, unprecedented prosperity now coexists with new patterns of poverty and with the reproduction of poverty where poverty already prevailed. So financialization has driven this restructuring of the global economy and this restructuring of societies around the world, nationally and globally as well. Financialization has also created a tendency towards short-termism and a tendency towards speculation, as opposed to long-term investment in pursuit of productivity growth. So accumulation, unsurprisingly, accumulation under neoliberalism tends to take the form of finance-driven bubbles that are parasitical on the intensified exploitation of the workers. Parasitical through the restructuring of production at the global level and the expansion of precarious forms of labor, culminating now in the gig economy. Parasitical through extractions from the periphery, through unequal trade, financial extraction, rents, and so on. Parasitical through the relentless plunder of nature. And these growth bubbles, they collapse. In the containment of the crisis and the follow-up of recovery, they always invariably require a state-sponsored salvaging process. Those cycles, you can go back. Those cycles include the international debt crisis of the early 1980s, the US savings and loans crisis of the mid-1980s, the stock market crashes of the 1980s and 90s, the Japanese crisis and permanent underperformance since then, since the late 1980s, the crises in several middle-income countries at the end of the 20th century, the dot-com, the financial and the housing bubbles of the early 2000s that led to declining investment and to increasing volatility both within and across economic and social sectors, both nationally and globally as well. Now, these limitations of financialization, these contradictions of financialization and neoliberalism have led to underperformance. Underperformance compared to the Keynesian golden age, the so-called golden age after the Second World War, even though neoliberalism has been associated with unprecedentedly favorable conditions for capital accumulation created by neoliberalism itself. Conditions that include the West's victory in the Cold War, the collapse of most nationalist movements in the global South, the liberalization of trade, finance, and capital movements around the world, the absolutely unparalleled support to accumulation that is provided by competing states, the reduction of taxation, of transfers and welfare provision in most countries, the decline of traditional sources of resistance, for example, trade unions and peasant movements, left parties and social movements of the left, and then the ideological hegemony of an absolutely bogus but vociferous free market capitalism. But instead of thriving on the basis of these incredibly favorable conditions, neoliberalism has underperformed economically and then has been troubled by instability, particularly since 2007, leading to the deepest and longest economic calamity and the weakest recovery and the most regressive economic recovery on record. So in this light, what I'm calling the economic paradox of neoliberalism is that the delivery by neoliberalism itself of extraordinarily favorable conditions for accumulation has been associated with an absolutely staggering inability to capitalize on those conditions. Now, the relationship between financialization and neoliberalism has been through three basic periods that are kind of loosely divided by the early 1990s and then by the global crisis. And this is inevitably more logical than chronological, but this is good enough as a starting point. The first phase of neoliberalism was the transition, or the shock phase, that goes against the previous system of accumulation with the aggressive promotion of the interests of private capital, regardless of consequences. And this transition, almost everywhere, requires intervention by the state, by force, to contain labor, to disorganize the left, to promote the transnational integration of domestic capital and finance, and to put in place the new institutional framework. And this can be illustrated by the military coups in Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina in the 1970s, then followed more systematically by Thatcherism and Reaganism and their offspring in the advanced economies, and then by structural adjustment in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa since the 1980s, and then by the transitions to capitalism in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, and this phase closes with the East Asian crisis in the late 1990s. Then we move on globally to a second phase, a mature phase, a third wayist phase within neoliberalism, which was a reaction to the dysfunctions and the adverse consequences of the first phase. This third wayist mature phase of neoliberalism focused on stabilization. It was the stabilization of the social relations that had been imposed in the previous period. It was about the consolidation and the expansion of the hegemony of finance in economic and in social reproduction. It was about the state management of the new modalities of international integration of economy, society, culture, and so on. And it was about the rolling out of new neoliberal, specifically neoliberal social policies to manage the deprivations that had been created in the previous phase and to manage the dysfunctions that neoliberalism had unleashed, and then to constitute neoliberal subjectivities. Now in this, the ideology of self-responsibility was very, very significant, because what self-responsibility implies is the withdrawal from the citizens of their collective capacities. It is the valuing of consumption above everything else. It is the placing of merit, of success, and then burden of failure on the isolated individual. And it is the suggestion that the resolution of every social problem requires the even greater individualization and financialization of social intercourse. So after the great financial crisis, we then move on to a third period within neoliberalism that is characterized by the loss of legitimacy. Loss of legitimacy following the absolutely stunning and astronomically costly flaws of financialization, and by the perception that neoliberalism had driven an accelerated concentration of income and wealth, and that it had imposed highly unpopular patterns of employment and social reproduction, and realization that even though neoliberalism had created entirely favorable conditions for accumulation, all this restructuring of the relationships between state, finance, and industry had failed to deliver macroeconomic stability, growth, employment, rising incomes for the majority. It has failed to do that. And those developments then had to be buttressed by increasingly repressive forms of rule, and then validated by selective discourses and practices of nationalism and racism. And this authoritarian shift, which we see now, is then now essential to sustain the system of accumulation, partly because it is unable, as well as being disinclined, to realize any form of shared prosperity. That's not what neoliberalism is about. So even though the policies that were imposed after the crisis did manage to restore the profitability of global finance, which we saw in the previous slide, the causes of the crisis have remained unaddressed. We're still open to a repeat. And the policies deployed to contain the crisis created new vulnerabilities. So for example, zero interest rates, the rescue policies, and quantitative easing was supposed to reduce systemic financial risk. What they did in reality was to create speculative bubbles, especially centered in the global south. Between the start of the crisis and 2015, the total debt of financial corporations increased by $12 trillion, public sector debt increased by $25 trillion, and the liabilities of households increased by $7 trillion. So where is this leading to? And it's not just that. Virtually all the gains achieved in the current recovery were captured by the top income strata. In the United States, again, our typical example, between 2009 and 2013, all the income growth went to the top 10% of families, and the income of the bottom 90% actually fell. Now that is a pattern of growth and development created by neoliberalism itself. Neoliberalism embodies very strong tendencies towards the concentration of income when the economy grows, tendencies towards the concentration of income when the economy contracts, and tendencies towards the concentration of income when the economy recovers. It is a perverse system of accumulation in this particular sense. But in addition to these economic processes, there's also a wide variety of political paths of transition to neoliberalism that I have touched on. And neoliberal transitions can take place by constitutional means. In most advanced economies, that's what happened. Neoliberal transitions can take place through terrorist dictatorships. See the example of many Latin American countries and sub-Saharan African countries. Or you can have coeval transitions to neoliberalism and to political democracy in countries like Brazil or South Africa or South Korea and across Eastern Europe. But what we also have is a typical democratic political form of neoliberalism spreading in the 1990s. And these were neoliberal democracies that were necessarily different from the political forms associated with the core countries in the classic liberal period before World War I, or different from the social democratic compacts that we saw again in the advanced economies after World War II. And the neoliberal democracy that we saw, especially during the 1990s, was limited, and it was contradictory at three levels. The first level is that neoliberal democracy is circumscribed. A neoliberal democracy will typically include an institutional apparatus that is deliberately designed to insulate decisions about economic policy away from the interference of the majority of the population. So all the substantive choices about the composition of output, the structure of employment, and the distribution of income will be transferred away into presumably technical institutions. That's ministries of finance that will be dominated by neoliberal policymakers. That is so-called independent central banks that will be captured by finance and mandated to deliver legally binding inflation targets, plus rescue feckless financial institutions when that becomes necessary. They will be transferred to treasury departments that are constrained by maximum fiscal deficits, except when they must provide unlimited resources to finance. They will be constrained by floating exchange rate regimes that will limit governments to following the wishes of the market traders. They will be constrained by privatized utility companies that will then be owned by transnationalized hedge funds. They'll be constrained by regulatory agencies that are all invariably captured by the conglomerates that are nominally under their authority. They'll be constrained by business associations, by international organizations, by the European Commission, by the US Treasury Department, the US State Department, by their local enforcers. And the authority of those institutions is underpinned by a judicial system that is tasked with enforcing the laws that neoliberalism itself has imposed. Now, these institutional structures effected, what they did was to transfer to finance the allocative functions that were previously performed by the Keynesian states. And they also locked in neoliberalism institutionally. Now, the result of that was the shrinkage of the policy space available to the institutions of nominally democratic states, together with the contraction of space for legitimate opposition. So increasingly, in a normal neoliberal democracy, politics became reduced to the competition between shades of neoliberalism in a heavily circumscribed political market. Politics was about New Labour versus moderate Tories in the UK. It was about Clinton Democrats versus establishment Republicans in the US. It was about centre-right versus centre-left in Canada, in France, in Germany, in Italy, possibly in Australia too, I don't know. But the limits of their friendly duel was then policed by a very aggressive and plutocratic right-wing media. In the country of Murdoch, you'll know what I'm talking about. These reforms were not just imposed by narrow financial elites aiming to control the state for their own selfish interests, not just that. The point is that the transnational integration, just a little bit more suspense, the transnational integration of production and finance directly constrains domestic policy space. When we have globalized production and consumption under the new form of US imperialism reconstituted after the Vietnam War, then you need to have international legal and policy harmony. You have to have constant negotiations. You need to have policy conditionalities. You need to have treaties, and then you need to drastically limit the scope for variety in modalities of social reproduction. So neoliberal states, neoliberal societies, neoliberal political systems inevitably tend to lose capacity to shape policy within their own borders. And that will inevitably reduce the scope for the political system to find negotiated solutions to national problems. And this is a degradation of democracy that will undermine neoliberal states and neoliberal political systems and will lead to a declining capacity of those states and those political systems to address conflicting demands. And the implication is that neoliberal democracies are intrinsically exclusionary at the level of decision-making around neoliberal lives, or neoliberalized lives. That's my first limitation. The second limitation of neoliberal democracy is because of the fact that neoliberalism has been associated with economic restructuring. It's been associated with the internationalization of systems of production across labor processes, across technologies, across inputs, across outputs, with implications for patterns of international specializations, patterns of employment, patterns of consumption, and forms of social reproduction and community life. And those processes have created a very large array of economic losers, centered around the working class, but going beyond it. Millions of skilled jobs have been eliminated, especially in the advanced economies. Entire professions have vanished or were exported. Employment opportunities in the public sector have worsened because of privatizations and the retrenchment of the state. Job stability has declined around the economy. Pay and conditions have tended to deteriorate under neoliberalism. There were very severe losses following for the informal workers who lost prospects of stable employment, and then also for skilled workers who feared the export of their jobs, and then also have to bear the stress of overwork because patterns of employment have tended to become more and more precarious, even for people in formal employment. And there are similar pressures on an indebted, impoverished, anxious, and increasingly vulnerable middle class around the world. So while those economic changes imposed by neoliberalism have created vast numbers of economic losers, the transformation of social structures, institutions, and the law have evacuated the political sphere, making those losers increasingly unable to resist against neoliberalism, increasingly unable even to conceptualize progressive alternatives, drawing from the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism and the weight of the media. But that was my second limitation. The third limitation of neoliberal democracy is then that the economic, political, ideological, and institutional hegemony of neoliberalism has been accompanied by a dramatic narrowing of political ambition and a dramatic narrowing of the scope for collective action because of two converging processes. One is the loss of sources of inspiration for policy alternatives after the collapse of the national liberation movements and national liberation governments in the global south, the end of the USSR, whatever you think of the USSR, all the changes in China, the collapse of revolutionary left parties in most countries, and so on. On the other side, you have the systematic escalation of the policing of dissent across individual privacy, civil liberties, and collective action, particularly clearly after 9/11. Now, the evacuation of political democracy tends to be perceived by the losers through the lens of corruption, of poorly specified elites, and undue privilege given to the undeserving poor, to minorities, to foreigners, and to foreign countries. Now, those groups are falsely taken to be favored by public policy, and then you reconstruct state institutions as being hostile to those presumably morally upright losers who increasingly find it difficult to make ends meet. Everything in the world seems to be upside down, in contrast with the misty olden days when people of good character, strong discipline in sharing our values, meaning mostly males with the right ethnic background, they could count on steady employment, rising incomes, promotion prospects, secure pensions. It was a good world if you belonged to that group of people. And this leads to a political paradox that I'll come back to in a moment. Of society, because of the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism, those demands of the losers tend to be framed in very general terms and drawing on simplistic discourses, drawing on common sense and on a universalist ethics based on identity. And this is an approach to politics that can lead to demands for the restoration of privilege. All this veiled by a classless discourse that focuses on moral values, focuses on justice, focuses on a level playing field, focuses on the assertion of traditional rights, focuses on demands for respect, and focuses on calls for honesty in public life. So in contemporary neoliberalism, the losers are increasingly driven to frame their disappointments, their resentments, their fears, their hopes through the prism of an ethical conflict between insiders and outsiders in a moral universe where there is no systemic exploitation. What is actually happening in this discourse is that our group is surrounded by predatory non-members. And within our group itself, honest individuals are besieged by dishonest characters. Our values of honesty and hard work are undermined by politicians stealing our money, by immigrants crowding us out of our houses and our hospitals, by distant countries stealing our jobs, and so on. So it's always the other. And these exclusionary tendencies have then been intensified by fiscal austerity that was imposed after the great financial crisis, have been intensified by the cumulative impact of low economic growth and then the degradation of economic prospects that follows from that, and intensified by the growing awareness of the inequities of neoliberalism itself. So the social and economic and institutional and political changes imposed by neoliberalism, they have fueled a narrative in which solutions have to come from outside politics because they cannot come from inside. Solutions have to be based on intransigent campaigns because you have to push hard to make a system that is institutionally rigid respond to your demands. And you have to project agency. Since you've lost collective agency, you project agency on individual leaders because all these structures of collective action have been disabled. Now, political activity along these lines will tend to lead, I would argue, to destabilizing but not to transformative outcomes for the system of accumulation. So in this sense, the hegemony of neoliberalism and the economic, social, and political degradation of the working class have unmoored neoliberal democracy, but they have also undermined the search for solutions and for alternatives. So the political paradox of neoliberalism, to me, is about the disintegration of neoliberal democracy through the weight of these tensions and these contradictions. Neoliberal democracy has emptied the state of political capacities. Neoliberal democracy has imposed institutional rigidity. It has reduced the space for political negotiation and for collective initiative. And the consolidation of this perverse political order has eroded its own legitimacy, and then the stresses of the global crisis have undermined the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism. This is a political crisis. And those circumstances promoted anti-systemic forces dominated by the far right, polarized by authoritarian leaders that promise to confront the neoliberal state, promise to confront finance, confront globalization, confront the elites, confront foreigners, and so on, and then in order to gain the support of the losers, and while at the same time, when they are in power, those leaders will push through policies that lead to the intensification of neoliberalism under the guise of nationalism and a more or less explicit racism. So the political crisis of neoliberalism is about much more than Donald Trump. Trump received less votes than Hillary Clinton. It's about much more than Brexit, because Brexit won at the margin, and there was absolutely no agreement. There could be no agreement about what the vote was for. It is the crisis of neoliberalism, the political crisis, is about much more than the authoritarian leaders that are emerging today. What we have now is a systemic crisis of severe consequences, severe implications for the system of accumulation. So the disintegration of neoliberal democracy first became evident when elected governments in the European Union were excluded from office and replaced by so-called non-party technocrats in the Eurozone periphery. And then subsequently a Greek administration that was elected for its advocacy of unconventional economic strategy was forced to abandon that strategy. And then the malaise reached the core NATO countries. Brexit won in the UK, Donald Trump won in the United States, In France, Marine Le Pen reached the second round of the presidential elections, which were then won by Emmanuel Macron, an unconventional politician leading a new political party completely aligned with neoliberalism. You have nativist populism thriving in Austria, in Switzerland, and across Scandinavia. If you look at the eastern periphery of the EU, you have a succession of far-right politicians prospering increasingly strident nationalist and exclusionary programs, because there is a new generation of nationalist parties and neo-fascist movements growing and threatening their power from the right. So, it seems clear that the rise of authoritarian forms of neoliberalism is not a transitory blip that will inevitably fail and then lead to the restoration of normal centrist, third wayist, Blairite, evacuated neoliberal policies. This is also not a marker of the end of neoliberalism, not at all. The rise of authoritarian neoliberal leaders is a symptom of the decomposition of neoliberal democracy. It is the outcome of the restructuring of economies, political systems, institutions of representation, and societies under neoliberalism. And it's evidence of the hijacking of mass discontent by the far right, given the destruction of the left. So their rise to power, their prominence is a sign of the emergence of new hegemonic blocs in global neoliberalism. A bloc that is emerging and that is grounded on the vulnerability of those losers to capture by the far right. They can recognize the damage caused by neoliberalism. They distrust the dysfunctionality of neoliberalism in the political domain, but those losers are led by politicians, by right-wing forces, by the media, to blame groups at the very bottom of society for the disasters that were created by neoliberalism itself. You have crises of provision of health, education, and housing. It must be the fault of people even poorer than us, who are taking what belongs to us. You have crises of deindustrialization, unemployment, de-skilling. It must be the fault of countries even poorer than we are. And these views are destructive of any form of collective identity. But then you cohere again. You can cohere society around the rejection of corruption and in support of nationalism, which is the only permissible form of collective identity under neoliberalism. But this easily slides into racism. So the systemic shortcomings, limitations of neoliberalism, they are dislocated towards issues of individual and country level dishonesty. Look at Trump's discourse as a clear example. Cheating, this sort of thing. And then the failings of the system of accumulation itself, they are disguised. Neoliberalism then offers people a way to respond to those injuries by reaffirming their innate virtues and their spirit of cohesion. And you use this to support reactionary programs that appeal to common sense and that are fronted by supposedly strong leaders who can talk honestly to you, who can represent the people, and who can get things done by force of will, supported by claims of business acumen. How many successful businessmen are now in politics? So personal strength of character and personal economic success are perceived to be essential to bulldoze through entrenched interests, bulldoze over corrupt politicians, selfish civil servants, captured institutions, all of which undermine our nation and undermine our people, harm our people. Now those authoritarian neoliberal leaders, they made their way to political power by using clever ploys, by using expensive advertising, through planned agitation, by brute force. All of this aiming to put in place a radical neoliberal program grounded on conservative politics, and then using the state to steamroll the opposition. This is not populism. This is not Bonapartism under neoliberal conditions. This is the politics of demagogues. It's the politics of con men, the politics of illusionists who have risen through the opportunistic exploitation of fractures in the neoliberal But to their right stand even more dangerous movements claiming to represent the losers in even more aggressive ways. So the transformation of authoritarian neoliberalism into material force is then the reflex of an increasingly desperate search by the losers for ways to short-circuit a political system that is unquestionably jammed, and then to try and secure gains for people who have grown tired of feeling unfairly disadvantaged and losing out to undeserving others that are creeping into their society. Now, the paradox of authoritarian neoliberalism to me is that it leads to the personalization of politics through the emergence of spectacular leaders that are untethered by stabilizing intermediary institutions, party structures, trade unions, social movements, the law. They despise all this, they ride over it. Those leaders are committed to neoliberalism and to the expansion of their own self-referential power, and they try to do this through the promotion of agendas that harm their own political base. In government, when they get to power, those leaders promote a radical version of neoliberalism, and they attack all forms of opposition. They promote unchecked financialization. They give even more power to the neoliberal elites that already support them. Society is even more divided, wages decline, taxes become more regressive, social protections are eroded, economies become more unbalanced, poverty grows. Mass frustration will intensify, leading to more unfocused discontent. The implication is that authoritarian neoliberalism is intrinsically unstable. It gives greater prominence and greater space to the far right, and as it does this, the politics of neoliberalism are even more steeply corroded from within. Modern forms of fascism follow from that. Let me wrap up. Neoliberalism is trapped by three paradoxes today. The economic paradox is that it has created favorable conditions for accumulation, but has shown an absolutely amazing inability to capitalize on that. The political paradox is that the consolidation of neoliberal democracy undermined the political order of neoliberalism and the ideology that legitimized it, and led to anti-systemic forces dominated by spectacular leaders, the rightward shift of the political spectrum, and the growth of the far right. The paradox of authoritarian neoliberalism is that the emergence of those political leaders that are committed to an extreme form of neoliberalism and committed to the consolidation of their own personal power, and those governments promote a radicalized version of neoliberalism, attack the opposition, destroy democracy as they impose an economic program that harms their own base of support. So these are political forms that cannot deliver stability. They are likely to lead to new forms of fascism, which are bound to grow, I think, as neoliberal economies continue to face volatility and political instability. In the absence of a strong left, neoliberalism is likely to enter a long period of crisis politics, with the emergence of political forms that are paradoxically anti-trade in the epoch of globalization. Political forms that are pro-finance when everyone recognizes the damages of financialization, that are anti-immigrant in an age of unprecedented human movement, and that are nationalist when you need international policy coordination for capital accumulation to be viable today. But those contradictions, they won't lead to neoliberalism being supplanted by a more progressive system of accumulation. Authoritarian neoliberalism is an original phenomenon. It has not emerged to shield capitalism against the rise of the left in a period of much smaller integration of production, like fascism did in the 1930s. This is a form of authoritarianism that is typically neoliberal. It expresses the co-option of the disorganized fury of millions of losers under neoliberalism in circumstances of an evacuated democracy, and then confronting a state apparatus that has lost legitimacy as the potential bearer of improvements in social cohesion. No one cares about that anymore. The rise of those authoritarian leaders and authoritarian neoliberalism in general, this comes from the degradation of economies, societies, and political systems by the global financial crisis, and then its additional degradation because of the containment strategies through fiscal austerity and the intensification of financialization. In the longer term, we have contradictions in the restructuring of production, social reproduction, and structures of political representation under neoliberalism. If you do not have systemic rivals at home or abroad, neoliberal authoritarianism will focus on attacking the weak, attacking immigrants, attacking refugees, attacking the undeserving poor, attacking women, and so on, under the guise of addressing corruption and undue privilege. So how do we address those regressive features, instabilities, limitations? In some sectors of the left, there remains the illusion that some form of return to Keynesianism can restore more favorable economic and social conditions today. But this would be a very limited effort because it would not touch on the determinants of long-term economic performance and the dynamics of the global economy under neoliberalism, which is what we have today. I think alternative programs have to draw, first of all, on traditional left concerns with equality, with improved distributional outcomes, and with the promotion of collectivity in the workplace and in society. They have to draw on the recognition that neoliberalism has demonstrated that it is resilient in practice and in the realm of ideas, and we need to overcome it, but this is a very ambitious task that includes but goes beyond electoral strategies and even changes in social policy or industrial policy or financial policy or monetary policy. And then, to transcend neoliberalism, we need to recompose the working class politically. And the way, I think, I would suggest to do this is through the convergence of struggles around the expansion and radicalization of political and economic democracy. And the way to make this operational, I suggest again, is through an immediate program of decommodification and definancialization of social reproduction, focusing on health, on transport, on housing, and so on. There are very compelling imperatives applying to the environment, to industrial policy, to energy policy, etc. And this will come in the realm of interventionist policy making confronting neoliberalism. The point is to open up a debate around alternative policies and then bring in mobilization around the challenges to the power of finance to organize and run our society. And I think there is mileage in this, and there is traction in this, as has been demonstrated by the Sanders campaign in the USA, by the Corbyn movement in the UK, by the achievement of left movements to political office in several countries recently, with Greece and Brazil in front. But the administration led by Syriza and the administration led by the Workers' Party in Brazil, they have led to stunning defeats. One, admittedly, through external EU power, the other mainly from internal forces, although articulated with US agencies. This is a difficult challenge, but the economic and political crises of neoliberalism are unique historical circumstances with very grave implications for the left, but also offering new opportunities for renewal, for influence, and for progress. Neoliberalism, if we look back historically, neoliberalism has never been so unstable, and its hegemony has never been so brittle. But it is for the left to mount an ambitious challenge on the basis of a profound critique of the ambitious agenda of neoliberalism with an equally ambitious agenda of the left to restructure society in a more progressive way. Thanks very much.
Alfredo, for an incisive and energetic diagnosis and challenge to all of us. So there's time for Q&A. So Ricky and Mike, if you can come up and grab a paper, you can have the first one over there, and the woman next to you can have the second one, and then I'll come to this side of the room.
Thank you for a very engaging lecture. I'm just wondering whether you stretch the term neoliberalism too far on a number of fronts. First of all, in equating it with financialisation, it seems to me that the breakdown of the social democratic settlement post-war and the rise of neoliberalism really predates financialisation. And secondly, with this phase or paradox that you refer to as authoritarian neoliberalism, the erection of tariff walls that we're seeing under Trump seems to me to be not consistent with what's generally understood as neoliberalism. And in Australia at the moment, we've got a government that's looking at intervening in energy markets to set benchmark prices and proposing state sponsorship of coal-fired power. Again, inconsistent with conventionally what certainly I've understood to be neoliberalism. And whilst it was a great descriptor of the fracturing we've seen in this phase of capitalism, it just seems to me that if neoliberalism becomes so overarching a phrase, is there a danger that it just loses meaning?
Yes, you've put forward a number of remedies for authoritarianism and neoliberalism, but I would venture to suggest that patterns in history have shown that whenever a tiny minority dictates the fortunes of the vast majority, usually the change occurs through war. Would you agree that that seems to be the development that might take place in our future?
My intention is not to stretch the term neoliberalism to the point where it becomes meaningless. My intention is to try and identify what is common across the different experiences, economic, political, social, of the age in which we live. So the insight is that there is something in common, something that travels across different parts of the world, something that can be compared and contrasted with the previous Keynesian social democratic phase of capitalism, something that can be contrasted with the liberal phase of capitalism, classic liberal phase of capitalism before World War I. And there are a number of features that we can use to make this systematic analysis, and I think financialization is the one that captures the most out of those different features. So does it lose meaning? I would argue no, as long as you can make the argument that financialization does provide this umbrella narrative. So would then Trump's tariffs and trade war against China, etc., be compatible with neoliberalism, yes or no? Well, my definition of neoliberalism does not draw on trade liberalization, it draws on financialization. So how does US trade policy connect with Trump's social base? How does it connect to Trump's industrial policy? How does it connect to US transnational financial interests? That would be the angle that I would look into. But absolutely, I think you do have a point there that Trump's discourse is a contradictory discourse that has elements of overt neoliberalism in it and elements that go against that. But from that, we have to distinguish the actual practice of his administration, where the most significant success has been the tax reform that is entirely, absolutely, completely regressive. And then an attempt to restore and shore up US prominence in global affairs. So there are multiple determinants there, but I think you can still trace the internal coherence of a neoliberal administration in what Trump is doing. So I hope the attempt to capture neoliberalism through the angle of financialization will be sufficiently robust. But we'll see. It remains to be seen. Remedies to authoritarianism through war. Well, capitalism is about the rule of the minority over the majority, but then so was feudalism, etc., etc. I hope it doesn't get to that point. I hope that economic interests, social interests, the institutional architecture built after the Second World War will prove to be sufficiently robust, or alternatively, that mutually assured destruction will be a deterrent to that sort of measure. But let's not forget that the invasion of Iraq and occupations of developing countries have occurred with tremendous regularity over time, when softer forms of political intervention in the global south in particular have failed, but not just in the global south. US-led intervention in the political affairs of Western European countries have been absolutely regular since the Second World War, the P2 scandal in Italy being just one example among many. So there's always a possibility of war flaring up. We hope that it won't happen. We hope that more progressive solutions will emerge, but we can't be sure. And because we cannot be sure, that's another reason why I think political activism is important, because this is not predetermined. These outcomes will be decided in practice by the ways in which we manage to intervene in global affairs in whatever way we can.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much. I thought that was a brilliant analysis of the other side from, I imagine, what everyone here in this room would stand for. I think that I'd like to hear you give another hour's lecture on the final point there, left alternatives, because I think that's part of the story, or the other side of the story, which needs a lot more analysis, because I believe there are left alternatives being mounted, and in fact the reaction, the popular reaction to this process is already underway. The problem is how to organise it and give it a strategy and so on. For example, in all Western countries, certainly in Australia, the United States and Britain, popular opinion polls show that the majority of young people now support socialism over capitalism. There's a massive crisis of legitimacy of the system. How is that going to be organised? And I really think we need to analyse the phenomenon of Sanders and Corbyn when we see the beginnings of a reaction against it. And left-wing and openly socialist people are winning primaries in the United States inside the Democratic Party, whatever we might think of that strategy. And in Australia, well, we have a crisis of our centre-right party.
So will we ask for more reflection on the Sanders-Corbyn experience?
Yeah, please,
okay.
Could you, well, Corbyn and Sanders, I think that's the phenomenon of a growing stated and openly socialist alternative to the system.
Okay, thank you. And one other, Ricky,
Thank you. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that lecture. What I'd like to know is whether you think that the ensuing crisis of global warming and climate change is capable of destabilising the rule of neoliberalism. It's very open-ended, but it seems to be...
question. Fantastic.
Let me start with the global warming issue. It is unbelievable, isn't it? Because you can absolutely, totally see that a purposeful capitalism would know exactly what to do in these circumstances. You can invest trillions of dollars, you can generate trillions in profits, you can create tens of millions of jobs, retrofitting the economy, changing the energy base of the earth. We cannot do this. There is a political deadlock in the system that it cannot move in that direction. So, barring, again, the strength of the left not being sufficient, we will all die. That's what's going to happen. And this is a failure of capitalism. Maybe 1 billion years from now, our remains will be excavated and a future species intelligent species will say, wow, capitalism killed them all. Oh, isn't it amazing? Let's not make the same mistake. Maybe that's the best we can hope for. But I hope not. I hope there will be a more short-term solution to this. Which is the issue of the left alternatives. And that is incredibly interesting. But let me give go one step back. I think there is a correspondence between the form of capital, the class structures that are associated with it, and the structures of political representation that correspond to that structure of class. So before 1917, you had a particular form of existence of the working class, then you had the Leninist type of party as a form of representation of those interests. In the interwar, since the Second World War, typical mass parties, typical form of organization, blue-collar or working class associated with Keynesianism in the West, and mass social democratic parties as a form of expression of their interests. And with neoliberalism, the decomposition of the class leading to no political representation at all in disorganized resistance. Maybe with what Sanders and Corbyn, etc., mean is the recovery of a form of political representation that corresponds to the mode of existence of the working class under neoliberalism. That is my hope. Maybe it's going to fizzle out. Maybe it's going to fizzle out again. The example of the UK is the one that I know best. There's two people at the top. There's Jeremy Corbyn, there's John McDonnell. They're both run over by a bus. I don't know what happens to that movement that now has between 400,000 and 500,000 people, at least as nominal members of the Labour Party. It's an unbelievable process. But the challenge there, barring the existence of this bus, the challenge there is one of confidence, is one of discussing with people how is it that their disorganized concerns can lead to an articulated, a sensible vision of the world, and then the confidence to act on that basis. This is the challenge. And then, having overcome this challenge, then there's the other challenge, which is the tools of repression. It is extremely difficult today to challenge the state, given the overwhelming weight of surveillance and police repression in the world in which we live. It is incompatible to the world in which I grew up when I was a student, when you could be an activist and not be immediately picked up, identified, targeted, and picked up by the forces of repression. These are twin challenges that we have today, but the only way to confront these challenges is by confronting them and pushing and see how far you can get. And I'm more optimistic now than I have been for many, many years. I am optimistic that there is traction in this mode of organization associated with Sanders Corbyn campaigns, etc. And I'm mildly confident that we will start to see, after many decades of defeat, we will start to see victories coming on the side of the left. But I'm an eternal optimist, of course.
Could you say something about China? Is this part of the problem, or by being a successful focus for capital accumulation, part of an alternative solution?
Thanks for that, it was great. How long do you think we've got to get our collective shit together?
In New South Wales and Sydney, given the state of public transport, that proverbial bus isn't arriving anytime soon.
Can I say something about China? No, of course not. China is too complicated. Is it a solution or is it a problem? It is both. It is a source of unbelievably rapid capital accumulation. It is the change in the world in the last several decades. It is the most incredible success in terms of elimination of poverty in the world, in the experience of the world. It is also a country that has given enormous support to the global neoliberal strategy without being itself a neoliberal capitalist economy, which is a paradox, but this is also the privilege of being a very large, very influential country in the world. You can dissent, you can draw your own trajectory. You have a state that is purposeful, organized, that has got a strategy, that has got a vision for itself, and that has been able very, very successfully to implement an accumulation strategy that has been an incredible success. But it also poses problems for China itself and its implications for the rest of the world. China does have a project for a greater sphere of influence that will inevitably, as it has happened already, clash with US hegemony in the Pacific and in other areas of the world. Where this will end, we have no idea, but it is an exciting conflict to look into. How long do we have? I have absolutely no idea, my friends. I wish I knew. I think we don't have very long. Especially in terms of the environmental constraint. In terms of authoritarianism, I'm optimistic that can be resolved. I'm optimistic that even though the momentum is with the far right, the left can get itself together and respond. But the environmental crisis is a tremendous unknown. We don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how long it will take to affect future generations. So it's a big unknown. Let's do something now, just in case.
Two final questions. Here.
Is there a possibility?
That's great.
The question is coming now. Is there a possibility then that it might be better for the left in some ways to fall down, to show that there is no cogent opposition, and then people have to look at, who is actually pulling the strings? Is that an option that might be actually possible?
Thank you. And
other than screaming hysterically, what can I do?
What should the left do? Definitely not fall down, because the left has fallen down for several decades, and it has had minimal influence on the broad traits of neoliberalism, and it has been able to contain the march of neoliberalism, but not really to change its direction. So if we decided to do absolutely nothing, I think the outcome would not be better than what we have now. It might easily have been worse in the sense of a greater acceleration. And then would it lead to spontaneous mass mobilization and everybody realized? No, it would lead to greater disorganization, incapacity, lack of experience, and inability to then get up and do something. So I think we have to do what we can. We have to do what we can in whatever ways you find useful and possible. I think the key there is the restoration of collectivity. Collectivity in the sense that you can only change the world by doing this together with other people. And to do it together, that requires confidence. You have to be confident that other people will turn up, when you will turn up in the morning, when it's cold, that it's inconvenient, etc. And other people will be there with you, and you sense the trust. And trust is something that you build. Now, that connects to something else that I'm not going to explore, but mobilizations these days, a lot of them follow through social media. And social media is great, and it gives access to a whole dimension of human existence that didn't exist before, and whole new ways to interact with people, but they don't give this physical immediacy that builds confidence. And I think that is really important, this capacity to be together and do things together. And that can be supported by new forms of mobilization, as the Sanders campaign in particular has demonstrated, underpinned by social media. But social media does not replace these bonds of trust between individuals. I think that is absolutely crucial. So whatever you do, do it with other people. And I think the reward will be really felt inside you, and much more effective outside as well.
to Sydney Ideas for their assistance with the promotion of